For a work session on AO 2022-64, an ordinance to the Anchorage Assembly amending Anchorage Municipal Code, Chapter 820, offenses against property to include a new offense for open burning. Today is the 8th of July. It is 2:11 p.m. And Madam Clerk, would you please take the roll?
Ms. Allard, Mr. Constant,
Here.
Mr. Cross,
Here.
Mr. Dunbar, Ms. LaFrance, Mr. Perez-Verdia, Mr. Peterson,
Present.
Ms. Quinn Davidson,
Here.
Mr. Rivera,
Present.
Mr. Salt, and Ms. Zalatel.
Here.
Thank you.
And I would note for the record, Member-elect Volland is also here. We start in just one sec. So the purpose of the meeting today is to have another discussion about this ordinance, which attempts to encode permanently the emergency ordinance that the Assembly passed in May that establishes under the criminal code an offense for open burning on your own or others' property at a time when there is a burn ban or prohibition because of environmental conditions. And so I am not sure who asked for the work session, and so I don't have a line of questions established, but I do know there have been a number of questions about the nature of making this permanent. And so I see Ms. Zalatel asked for this work session, and Ms. Zalatel, why don't I go ahead and hand you the floor if you wanted to just begin the conversation for the purpose of sparking an open deliberation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I did ask for the work session when I moved to postpone the item. I think we all received some communications around concerns of codifying this and what the impetus is to have this codified versus being able to use the emergency ordinance mechanism when needed, and the overall effect of having this codified. Like, what does it mean, and how have we seen it played out to date? I think we heard a little bit about that in the Public Safety Committee, but really I'm still missing it, and one of the reasons I wanted a work session is, why do we need to codify this as a permanent tool within the municipality's toolbox to address fire danger versus utilizing something such as an emergency ordinance?
So that's the impetus of the meeting. I don't know if there are any specific questions. We have in the room a bank of attorneys. So Ms. Christensen, why don't you take the floor, and you can introduce folks if you want. And I'm going to step aside for just a minute.
Good afternoon, Blair Christensen, Deputy Municipal Attorney. We have here today myself, Sarah Stanley, the Municipal Prosecutor, Mario Bird, Acting Municipal Attorney, and Sarah with you is Mr. Chad Flanders. So those are all the attorneys in the room. And Dean Gates, obviously.
Sorry about that. And Meg or anybody, do you have specific questions? Mr. Rivera?
Yeah, thanks. So I have a list of questions here. This was gone over a little bit at the Public Safety Committee, but hopefully you can just reiterate. So for the period of the emergency ordinance that was put in place, one, can you just reiterate what that period was? And then two, how often was the provisions in that emergency ordinance used?
Through the chair, I'm going to ask Sarah Stanley to come up to answer at least part of that.
Through the chair, thank you.
Through the chair, I pulled the number of cases that have been inputted so far into our system. So it's not quite up to date as of today, but the number that has been put in based on this emergency ordinance, since it passed, there's 11 of them. And also since the same date, there have been 5 cases that came in under our other already existing code, either criminally negligent burning or failing to control or report a dangerous fire, which are already in municipal code.
And I can answer the other question. So the original emergency ordinance passed on May 24th and is in effect for 60 days. So that would be July 23rd.
Got it. Are there other people in the queue, or may I go on? Okay. That's interesting. So there's 2 different provisions of code. What's the sort of penalty under the 2 different provisions?
Those other 2 provisions are both Class A misdemeanors as well, just like the emergency provision.
Okay, so we always had those provisions in
Yes.
code.
They're already there.
Okay. So I guess what's the enforcement difference? Like, why would someone be under one particular type of code and not the other?
So criminally negligent burning requires damaging property of another. So just the existence of a fire is not enough. Property has to be damaged. For failing to control or report a dangerous fire, we would have to prove that the fire was endangering the life or substantial property of another. So again, not just enough that there's a fire there, but that it's actually far enough gone that it's a substantial danger.
Okay, got it. I think I understand that difference. And it would be helpful for reference if you could, do you have that code section?
It's the first one, criminally negligent burning, is 820.030, and failure to control or report a dangerous fire is 820.035.
Thank you. So, so one of the things in here in the AM that's used as an argument is that these, what you're trying to codify is already in state law. Can you tell me how, if you have the statistics, how often that particular part of state law is used?
Before you answer, I just know for the record on the phone, we have Chief Shruggy.
Through the chair, the municipal prosecutor's office does not prosecute state crimes. Right? Well, we do, you do, but like generally, a lot of those would be referred to the DA's office.
Sure.
And so we wouldn't necessarily have access to the statistics. I mean, certainly we can reach out to the district
Do
attorney.
you know if it's something that they report out publicly, or we would have to like do a records request to get that kind of information?
Through the chair, the fire chief might actually have a better idea, not to put him on the spot, but he might know that.
Hi, Chief Shoggy. So the question that I had for our attorneys here was, do you know how many times the state law, because there's a comparison being made in the AM for this ordinance that what's being requested to be codified is similar to things that are already in state law. So do you know how often those provisions in state law are used?
Through the chair, Chief Rogge here. No, I don't know. It's possible that Chief Curl or I guess the law department would know that, but I don't have the answer to that.
Through the chair, in my discussions with APD, my understanding is that APD charges the state law crimes on state lands, like in state park lands and stuff like that. When in the general vicinity of the municipality, they charge from the code.
Okay, got it. That makes sense. All right.
Hey, can you hear me? This is Chief Curl.
Oh,
Thanks, Chief. I was just going to text you and ask you if you're around. So Wonderful. You have the floor.
Hey, so I'm looking at the fire arrests that we've made since January till June, and I can tell you that we charged state 8 times of the 26 times we've arrested, we charged state 8 times. And most of those are for criminally negligent burning in the second degree.
Great, thanks. I think that paints a good picture for me. I'll go ahead and yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. I'm going to ask a follow-up question to that. You gave the time frame of January to June. And so can you see the month-by-month details? Because I would assume then the difference are all from May 25th until now.
Well, yeah, I'm looking at month to month, and from May 25th, we had one arrest in April. From May 26th till June 8th, we've 11 arrests for varying things, and one of them, actually 2 of those were state charges.
Okay, thank you. I think Mr. Cross is in the queue.
Yes, thank you. My question is regards to this section A2. It says to permit any open burning on public land to continue in that person's presence without calling emergency services when such a burning is suspended or prohibited pursuant to AMC 1530. So is my understanding that if there is open burning during a suspended period, and although you're not the one doing the burning, but it's in your presence and you don't call emergency services, that's a misdemeanor? Am I reading this correct? Thank you.
So I can answer that, but I'm not an attorney. And I think the answer is yes. And it was described to me in the process that the problem, and maybe the chief or one of the chiefs can help with this. The problem is you come across a fire and a bunch of people are burning it and everyone says, not mine. And then you have no actionable decision to be made because you can't say this was John Smith or Jane Smith. It's nobody. And so that's what I think the purpose of that section of the language is. And now the attorneys can shake their heads or nod verbally.
So through the chair, in discussing the issue with APD, and I want to speak for Chief Curl, but part of the issue that we ran into, or one of the issues that was raised to us by APD was, and to be clear, A2 is specifically limited to public land. So it doesn't apply to all land, it only applies to public land. But because of the large swaths of public land in Anchorage, APD said they had no tools for exactly what Mr. Constant was saying. When they show up and there's a burn going and everyone says, not mine, not mine, not mine. So in an effort to deal with that problem, but limit it as much as possible, we can find that one to public lands. And so it hopefully deals with APD's issues, but limits the criminal penalties as much as possible.
Okay, and I really appreciate that. And I guess I see that. I can see where they need a tool to do this. You know, we had the same issue under SB 91. You know, individuals would break into a property and they'd all claim, I didn't break into it, someone let me in, and they would only get charged with trespassing as opposed to breaking and entering. And so law enforcement's hands were tied. So, you know, under first scrutiny, I was a little concerned about this, but under further explanation, I can see where it's warranted. So thank you.
Other members? So, you know, I will speak seeing no one in the queue, that the crux of the problem, the question why it's not just a no-brainer, is that people have concerns, and rightly so, about due process for how this law will be applied. And the fear that I've heard from a number of people, we heard from the ACLU, which is kind of standard fare, that it would be applied to people who are living out in the woods or staying out in the woods only, or in a way that is out of alignment with fairness, that it's not going to be applied to folks living in an area on Government Hill who are having an open burn when there's a burn ban, but it will be for others. And so in my mind, I struggle with that conversation, and I've been able to balance it for myself with the fact that this provision of code is only in effect when a suspension or prohibition occurs. And so I'm hoping we can have some kind of a conversation about that between us and the attorneys, us and the chiefs, so we can really make sure we make a decision that's based on the best policy proposal possible. And so that's the big picture, but the smaller picture is we probably need to have a discussion about what's the difference between suspended or prohibited. So that question maybe we can take on as well. But I want to make sure we have that substantive, thoughtful conversation. And my phone is blowing up, so I might have started some things. Let's see. Nope, they're not. So those are the two questions I have. The specific is, what's the difference between suspended and prohibited? I'm guessing prohibited means in places you can never burn, but I don't want to assume. And then the bigger picture question is, what's the ramification of the due process question on how this law will be applied?
The language of suspend or prohibit was borrowed straight from AMC 1530-080B that says the director may suspend or prohibit open burning at any time based on air quality considerations or upon consultation with the fire chief for fire safety reasons. So that language just came right from that code.
So great. And what does that mean? There's two words there. They must have a difference in meaning. I don't understand.
Through the chair, or you're the chair, never mind. Chief Schragi might be able to define that better. I mean, I will say legally, we're confined, like the code says what it says. But to the fire department, there might be a difference. Chief Schragi, do you have an answer for that?
Through the chair, yes, I can speak to that. The language is confusing, and it's confusing to the public, and it's confusing to us, frankly. So we have actually gone to our website and changed the verbiage that we use on our daily burn bans. So in fact, you won't see the word ban on our, like if you go to the muni.org or the AFD website and look at the fire danger status, you won't see the word ban on there. You'll see burning is prohibited on certain days. So we've begun using the word ban internally and outwardly facing to reflect a Title 15 burn ban, which is one where we would declare a general burn ban across the municipality as we did in June. On the website, when the fire danger based on the indices moves out of moderate and into high, very high or extreme, then we have varying levels of prohibitions on burning. So we're using the term burning is prohibited, which is tied on the daily fire indices, fire danger, and we're using the term ban to describe a Title 15 ban, which is applied municipality-wide.
So that even muddles it slightly more because the code talks about suspended or prohibited, and I'm just not sure what the difference is between those terms. And maybe it's just inartful code drafting, or there was at some other time some other definition, but it sounds like you use the term prohibited, so it might be warranting a code project in the future to make that language more clear.
You read my mind that the Department of Law is happy to work with the Assembly and the Fire Department to better define those, because there is a definition section in that portion of the code, but those words are not included in the definitions.
Okay, so then for the purpose of this record, I'm going to assert that unless otherwise proven, the terms suspended or prohibited are synonyms. Okay, so then back to the bigger, more substantive question. And I don't know how we approach that.
So, Mr. Con, you said due process. and I think I might be answering, I can answer the question, but I'm not sure that that's the term that you meant to use.
I could put a fine point on it, or equal protection. I'm
E-
sorry.
okay.
That's what I really meant. Equal protection. Due process is clear. We have the law. I'm sorry.
Yes.
You're absolutely right. It's the equal protection issue. I'm not an attorney. So do I need to put a fine point on it, or
No.
should I leave the record? where
That
it
is, that is the exact point I wanted to clarify.
stands? Okay. Thank you.
So certainly the ACLU might have different opinions than I do, but generally applicable laws like criminal laws can be challenged on an equal protection basis, but I think it's difficult to assert that engaging in criminal conduct like open burning during a burn ban is going to be an equal protection issue just because of the health and safety. Equal protection analysis requires the balancing. And because this particular criminal statute is only enforced during burn bans and during times when the health department director and the fire chief have made, a decision that weather factors and, the nature of Anchorage's public lands, the amount of public lands and all of those things create a substantial danger of wildfires that we all know can spread rapidly up the hillside through, the whole East Anchorage area, that balancing those factors, that the criminal penalties are only in place for a very narrow period of time during these extreme factors, that those factors would weigh in favor of the law.
So, right. And in the ideal, I think that's easily agreeable. What always comes to mind in these conversations is the truism by Ruth Bader Ginsburg that a tax on yarmulkes is a tax on Jews. And so if we're creating a policy that's only applied to people who are living in camps functionally, then do we have a problem is really where my head is at in these questions. Are we, but I think that practically speaking, if we analyze the 11 or so arrests or whatever the number is, 26, probably they aren't all in one place. They're probably on private lands and they're probably everywhere. So there might be an answer in the data for us. But to me, that's the challenge is how do we ensure that these laws aren't just applied to people living in the woods?
I'm going to hand the question to Ms. Stanley.
Out of the 16 cases from all three bits of code in June, since this started, 11 of them seem to me to be people who were homeless and or camping.
Right.
And I'm saying that just based on my reading of the police reports. So yeah, a little over half, but there were other people also prosecuted under that.
That's helpful information for me. Thank you. Mr. Bond.
I have two questions. In item 2, without calling emergency services, what happens if someone doesn't have access to a phone or service? And then my other question is, I've seen signs talking about this when I've been walking my dog on the coastal trail. I don't know if this is a question for you all, but what has the public outreach been on this? Where are signs being posted? Is there social media announcements that have been made? Where is that messaging being targeted?
So on the messaging question, I think it's not best answered by the attorneys. And I don't even know, I would suggest that's a Parks and Rec answer and they don't have them here. But personally, I can say I have seen burn ban signs published around our green belts and substantial social media communications around the time when these policies went in effect. And so I don't know that would be status quo in the future, but for this process, I even took pictures of signage that said there is a burn ban and there is now criminal, be careful. So, but we would need parks here for that, I think.
Yeah, I've just seen some chatter online about these signs only being posted in certain areas, and is that meant to convey a message to a certain population? So that's a concern that I have.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, takes us back to the center of that question. That is the rub of this issue.
Through the chair, I agree with Mr. Constant. The legal department is not generally involved in media blitzes, but I do believe that the administration engaged in one, and I think the appropriate person would probably be Ms. Demboski because she has some handle on which departments did what. As to your question about without calling emergency services, Ms. Stanley can weigh in on this. Did you want to weigh in? There's certainly defenses within criminal law that would probably apply. And additionally, as the prosecutor, Ms. Stanley's office has prosecutorial discretion, and I can't speak for her, but when they see facts like that, my guess would be that they probably do not prosecute those kinds of cases, but she can probably answer.
Yes. So it is true that not everyone has a cell phone, right? Who's next to a fire in Chester Creek, Greenbelt. We do have, every case that we come in, we decide whether to prosecute it. If we read in a police report that someone says, yeah, I walked up and there was this fire and I was concerned about it and I didn't know how to get help, we wouldn't be prosecuting it. The only other way to address that would be to directly put extra language in the code, which might make it more unwieldy. So.
Certainly raises a number of questions. Like the calling is a very firm directive, but call phones are pretty universal. But it's a very interesting piece of language because I don't know that we have a directive in the code anywhere else that says you must call. I don't.
Other than mandatory reporters.
But that doesn't say you must call. It says you must
But you
report.
you must report. And I think that's true. And it certainly, this body is free to make amendments that they feel better characterize the will of the body.
I just wouldn't know what that word might be.
Certainly report, right, might better encompass what you're trying to get at. If they go to a road and try to flag someone down, or if they ask another person, right, they try to get a hold of somebody else on the trail and have the other person call, or contact emergency services, or or attempt to engage another to contact. Right, something like that. I mean, because certainly if you don't have your phone on you, but you stop somebody else who has a phone, that would seem to meet the goal of what we're trying to do here.
Right, and language that implied they must try wouldn't be sufficient because that would put you in a tautological box where all they would have to say is I tried. Right, and so in the same scenario as everybody's hands are in the air, it wasn't me. And so it's a very interesting catch there. Chief Shragi, do you have any philosophical thoughts to apply to the question about the fairness issue? And that's not really your job. Your job is fire, but.
What I can say is that I do think the emergency ordinance has been effective at raising awareness of the danger of fires in all the populations that we encounter. So in that regard, I think it's been good for us.
So, Chief, another question then. It was asked, the question at the beginning, I think before you arrived, why wouldn't we just do this by EO when we need it, emergency ordinance? And so my question is, in the summertime, in your experience, how often are we moving in and out of these cycles of having prohibitions? Like how frequent is it? How often is it on and off? Just a sense. I don't need a data answer to that, but just a kind of a professional opinion.
Thanks for the question. It's hard to generalize because it seems like it's becoming more frequent, and I'm speaking of my experience across the state, not just here in Anchorage. I would say with regard to this summer, we had 1 month stretch where we instituted a Title 15 burn ban, and to roughly coincide with the activation of the emergency ordinance. And there were times during that period in which the emergency ordinance was in effect and in which the burn ban was in effect, where the fire danger moderated a little bit, and a decision we struggled with, knowing that it was going to dry up again the following weekend. Do we lift it now and reinstitute it, or do we just let it go on? And in the interest of transparency and being truthful with the public, we decided to lift the ban, and we were prepared to reinstitute it if necessary. We haven't reinstituted it now. We're just doing it on a day by day basis and it's paired with our daily fire danger.
That actually rises a whole other complexity to the question, right? The complexity being, how does a member of the public know on a daily basis whether it's acceptable or not if the policy is set on when we have a ban in place and we're going day to day? So is the assumption then, if we're on this day-to-day benchmark, then this is not in effect?
I agree with that statement if that's a question.
It was a question, is if we don't have that larger burn ban in place, but instead you're doing the daily analysis, then the burn ban and this criminal section of the code is not in effect.
That would be my assessment. Yes.
Okay, I have 3 people in the queue now: Mr. Cross, Ms. Alatel, Mr. Peterson.
Thank you. I was going to go back a little bit. I was in the queue for a while, but first, on about 15 minutes ago, you were speaking to suspended versus prohibited, and my understanding was suspended was a restriction. However, perhaps it was being allowed with a special permit or special authority. Therefore, there may have been extreme restrictions, but it wasn't completely prohibited. Prohibited is none whatsoever. So I guess that was, when I saw that, I did my research. Now, obviously, legal would need to clarify and see if it's something that codifies the difference between suspended and prohibited, but that was the thought I had on it. The next is regarding this law being unfairly implemented. I think, we're not applying it unfairly to individuals. We're applying it equally to everybody. However, with any kind of activity, there are certain individuals who have a propensity to participate in a particular activity. In this, it may be people who live in the trees, it may be those, but it's no different than gun restrictions unfairly target military, since they have an overwhelming majority of firearm owners. You could argue that gun bans unfairly target military or something. I think it is how the law is applied to the people, not if it is targeted towards the group. And so, again, attorneys, but I think, and also going with that is the last statement here as far as how does the public know? I happen to have great faith in our law enforcement and our fire department that if they see something that someone doesn't know, they would issue a warning and seek to educate. I do not see them as a strong arm that is just looking to write out citations. I think that's evident in the number of calls they've had versus the number of citations they've actually given. And so with some of this comes some trust in our law enforcement to implement this with an understanding that they are there to help the public and seek to educate them for a better acreage and not just hand out citations aggressively. So those are my thoughts on that. Thank you.
Ms. Alatel.
Thank you. I've appreciated the conversation, and at this point, I have some real concerns around notice to individuals when there is a burn ban in place, particularly those who may have a higher propensity to need to light fires to meet their basic needs, as well as kind of just the utility of this. What I've heard is there's a lot of prosecutorial discretion, which there always is. There are other tools at our disposal, and that it's I think there've been significant questions raised here. So I guess my final question is there any intent by the administration to bring an S version that would address some of these issues around notice and just a lot of the concerns that were raised? It feels, if we're going to do this, it feels incomplete because emergency ordinances often are, because they're instituted in an emergency fashion, but this one seems to leave a lot still to the unknown, which is not usually how we go about changing our municipal criminal code. Thanks.
Mr. Peterson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I'm just looking at the situation like we've had this year where it's been extremely dry for the last 2 months. A case could be made that when it's dry like this, that the burn ban would be ongoing every day. And so you'd almost, as an individual living in this town, you'd almost have to assume that the burn ban was in effect unless we had gotten a major rain overnight or something. And even a rain like we had yesterday is not going to reduce the fire danger for very long, especially when the sun comes out the next day like it did today. So, yeah, we're putting a lot of emphasis on individuals keeping track of whether there's a burn ban in effect or not, and so it's hard for us to know whether they know there's a burn ban in effect or not, and so we would be having to prove that they knew that there was a burn ban in effect in order for this case to go through and them to be found guilty. At least that's the way I'm seeing it. Is that correct?
Yes, that would be correct.
Ms. Stanley. So, Mr. Rivera, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So I want to just circle back to something that Ms. Zolotel stated. And, I just want to echo that whenever we change penal code, I think we need to be very thoughtful about it. Just going back to my very first ordinance, it was a change to penal code. And boy, did I have to be very careful about what I did there. And even in the end, I still pissed people off, which is fine. So I guess just asking the question that Ms. Zolotel asked, is the administration planning on bringing an S version forward of this ordinance to clarify some of the holes that were raised by Ms. Zolotel?
Through the chair, Mr. Rivera, if we're speaking about notice, first of all, I think that I agree with what Mr. Peterson said, that certainly during this, at this point in time, and I think into the future, it sounds as though we may be entering a time where during the summers, a lot of people, there should be an assumption that there's a burn ban unless you have several days of rain, and that we should be facilitating a culture and education in which we're reinforcing those ideas, because the situation's not going to get better. I will tell you that I drive by a fire station every day on my way to work and every day on my way home, and they post whether it's a burn ban outside the fire station. We put it on the municipal website every day. It's updated on the AFD website. It's updated every day, right? I think that I often hear it on the radio during the weather reports. I hear it on the news during the news reports. But I think what we really need to be fostering is this idea that the climate in Alaska appears to be changing. The summers are getting hotter and drier, and these wildfires are going to be becoming more frequent and more dangerous. And I think people really need to realize that, because it's a substantial risk to life and property.
Thanks. So I'm assuming then the answer to my question is no, the administration does not plan on bringing an S version.
So through the chair, I will say from the Department of Law, no one has raised, until today, until this work session, no one has raised questions to the Department of Law.
Mr. Gates had raised his hand, so he might have some phone a friend.
Well, yes, I just wanted to add something. I think that what we're getting at is sort of the mental state element of this misdemeanor offenses. And we already have in our penal code and Title 8, and Stanley knows it better than I do, but I was just looking it up here. What we have in the ordinance is just this one offense, but we have in section 805.15 in our definitions that apply to this offense and other offenses in Title 8 are definitions, and actually 805.010B that says these mental state elements will apply to criminal offenses. Conduct, if it's an element, is knowingly, the mental state of knowing, and for circumstance, the mental state has to be recklessly, and it incorporates the state law definitions of these mental state elements. And those definitions are really basically what Mr. Peterson's described, and what Ms. Christensen and Stanley have also explained. But I wanted to read out just this one phrase from our state law about recklessly, that mental state element, which I think would apply to a circumstance, which is whether there's burn ban in effect or not, right? And this part in AS 1181-900A, person acts recklessly with respect, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here, with respect to a circumstance described by provision of law, when the person is aware of and consciously disregards a substantial and unjustifiable risk that the circumstance exists. And I think that that's really what Mr. Peterson and our attorneys have described. When we have so many days of sun and all this climate change we have going on, I mean, and a person would have to have their head in the sand to not sort of understand that there's probably a burn ban in effect on that day when there was a fire that they should have reported. And that would be part of, I think, the prosecution's burden to show that maybe by on that day when they were charged, that they had all this media and exposure and so forth, and a whole week of dry, hot weather. So that would be the mental state element that they're required to prosecute. So I hope that's helpful, at least, to say why we don't really need to put it into this specific ordinance. It's already sort of included through our general provisions of Title 8, but it's helpful here at the work session to explain how the mental state elements included.
So I did a little poking around on my own, which is dangerous, and came up with an alternative definition for suspension when we have suspended or prohibited. When I just put in a search, fire, suspension, Alaska, and Anchorage, it came up to the State Department of Natural Resources. The state's term when a fire ban happens is a suspension. And so it could very well be that the term suspension in our code references the state process and the prohibition references our own in title, I think it's 15. And so I don't know that. That's a Wagner. It's a wild guess. But with that, and I just, there was an interesting allusion made toward guns and bans and military and the police and their intentions. I want to speak briefly to that I fully trust and support our law enforcement, they're professionals. And at the same time, it isn't so much about laws that apply to people. It's about how laws that apply generally are enforced on people. And so if in fact you had a gun law that said guns are prohibited generally, and yet that enforcement only happened in Mountain View or in a neighborhood of lower income and poverty, that would be where the questions of equal protection arise, not in the actual law because the law is written generally, but in how it's applied. And so again, I'll end where I started. I don't believe APD enforces law in that manner. I believe they're professionals, but I think that there's somewhat a difference there between what we're talking about here and how it was presented previously. And so we have approximately 12 minutes or 15 minutes. And are there any specific proposals for amendments that we want to discuss here? Because the question of amendments was raised, but the amendments aren't coming from the administration.
Mr. Constant, if I may.
Yeah, Ms. Christensen and then Ms. Alto's in the queue.
I did just want to say, to the extent that Mr. Rivera or Ms. Alatel raises issues, if they do have specific issues, Department of Law is open to receiving that and working with you two on that, if you would like.
Okay, I see nodding heads. Ms. Alatel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Christensen. One of the concerns I have about amendments is that if amendments are brought on the floor, which of course members can do, is especially when we're looking at municipal code, is that those amendments don't necessarily cooperate with one another or make for fair, equitable, and enforceable criminal code. So I'm happy to email my concerns, but I would really hope that other members might do the same to the Department of Law so that they could be considered for an overall S version if this is going to move forward. And, you know, I'm willing to take a look at an S version. In that way, I'm just concerned if we do a hodgepodge of amendments, we can end up in a very odd place by the time it comes for the final vote. Thanks.
Through the chair, Ms. Alatel, I agree. The Department of Law would prefer that, not that we have any say, but that the Assembly doesn't do a bunch of floor amendments on the penal code because that could get kind of messy. So I agree with Ms. Alatel. To the extent that any Assembly members have concerns or ideas for changes, we'd be more than happy to work on those before the Assembly meeting.
And I do request that you include Dean in the loop so that we make sure that if he has separate communications coming from other members that may or may not be here, that they all get kind of funneled into a broader conversation, not violating open meetings, but narrowing who's working on what so that it's rational.
We will always include Mr. Gates.
Of course. I was more speaking to the members, but so, you know, I personally lean towards supporting this code at this time because of the danger, but I recognize the real issue of Monday it's on and Tuesday it's off, Wednesday it's off, Thursday it's on, and how does a member of the public in any space know that? And so I'm not sure how to answer that question, and it might be that there's a time frame around these procedures that sets it up. If it goes in effect, it's in effect for a date, certain time, amount of time. And then if it's extended for a similar amount of time. And then if it's rescinded, it's very broadly broadcast in some way. So that way people have some way to rely on information and know, as opposed to, again, that idea of it being different every day of the week is kind of impossible for a regular person to track. Anyone else? Thoughts, questions, concerns? Well, with that then, oh, wait, I see Kevin. Go ahead, Mr. Cross. Go ahead. You get the last word.
Mr. Johnson, actually, that's a pretty good idea. I mean, we could apply it much like you do the studded tire ban, right? So between a specific time, let's say the middle of May and the first week of September, there's fire restrictions in place and that this burn ban applies unless otherwise withdrawn, just given the climate of everything, and that pun intended. But, you know, that'd be a way you do it, you codify it, and then during certain times of year where it's not happening, those restrictions are not in place. So,
Kevin, I'm going to appeal to the libertarian in you that I know exists and just say, imagine a scenario where Anchorage said you can't burn all summer long. And so I think a slightly narrower approach to that question might be better. The government that governs least the government's best, but at the same time that protects the public health. And so we'll figure that line out. I don't know that I'd be willing to support a complete and total summer burn ban in Anchorage because I would like to live here. So I don't want to get chased out on a rail. So thank you, everybody. And with that, I give you back your Friday.